The human rights issue I'm going to talk about are the abortion restrictions in the United States after the overturn of the Roe v. Wade precedent. I'll be specifically analyzing how these bans have disproportionately affected women of color. It is evident that this issue is gendered, but I believe there's a strong racial aspect to it as well. Identification of the human rights issue. The human rights issue of withholding the right of bodily autonomy, thought, and belief through anti-abortion regulations goes against the international human rights law. A description of the human rights issue. The spark that started this current issue occurred in June of 2022 with the United States Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs v. the Jackson Women's of Health Organization, where the court failed to adhere to the longstanding precedent of Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion in America. That decision has now been given to the states. On the right-hand side, there is a map of the states in America that have banned abortion at conception or after 6 weeks. There's a common theme here with the southern states sticking together onto the belief that abortion should be criminalized. Specific effects on women of color. Taking the right away from all women is disheartening in itself, but there are inequalities in resources that make a bad situation worse for women of color versus white women. Women of color in the States have more abortions than white women, as 30% of them are African American, 21% of them are Hispanic, and 7% are from other ethnic groups. As they are the majority group for having abortions, their access to them is that much more vital. Insurance coverage for abortions for women of color is an issue since 24% of Indigenous, 24% of Hispanic, and 13% of Black individuals are not insured in comparison with 9% of white women. Ethnic women in this case are disadvantaged since they're less likely to attain adequate insurance that covers abortion costs. Although many women of color are on Medicaid, the state's public health insurance designed for low-income individuals, there are issues intertwined with abortion access that will be addressed later on. A continuation of the specific effects. The intersection that some women of color also struggle financially lowers their options of traveling out of state to get abortions. Black women ages from 18 to 49 are 3 times more likely to not own a vehicle in relation to white women. Other additions like transportation, flights, rental cars and gas, accommodations like overnight stays at hotels, and childcare are other factors that women of color need to take into consideration but cannot sacrifice. An increase in reproductive related deaths. The statistics shown here are actually the rates of women of color reproductive related deaths before abortion was even banned. So with this data in mind, we can only assume that this number will skyrocket. America's past of restricting women of color's bodily rights. America's history of control and exploitation on women of color's bodies makes the removal of bodily autonomy today a reoccurring cycle. For instance, during the period where slavery occurred in the States, slaveholders would allow the rape of enslaved Black people as it increased their productivity. In the 20th century, forced sterilization of over 70,000 Black women occurred as white extremists were fearful of their race decreasing. And this act was run by American government-funded programs. From the 1930s to the 1970s, 1/3 of Puerto Rican women living in the States were sterilized by force and without consent. This event was called l'occupation. Many of these women were also unknowingly lab rats for a new hormonal birth control that was unapproved by the Food and Drug Administration. Indigenous women were also exploited in the reproductive sense. During the 1900s, countless states passed laws that granted them the right to sterilize anybody who they believed were feeble-minded. They would typically sterilize people at government-run boarding schools in which the main attendees were stolen Indigenous children. In all, the state decided abortion laws are that much more upsetting to women of color as it is reminiscent of their past struggles of bodily autonomy being unattainable. What has been done to address this issue? There's no policy at large that specifically combats or attempts to remedy the situation of how America's abortion restrictions affect women of color. However, women of color are highlighted in President Biden's verbal plan for addressing the abortion ban. President Biden has recently steered his 2024 election campaign on addressing his disagreement on the overturn of Roe v. Wade. During this campaign, he has proudly stated that he would sign on any legislation that would turn the decision of Roe v. Wade into law. And if Congress attempted to put a countrywide abortion ban, a veto would be used immediately. On the right-hand side are photos of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris speaking out at these campaigns, promoting abortion rights. Biden's main administrative plan to help women gain access to safe abortions is through the encouragement of states to utilize Medicaid to cover these costs. Again, Medicaid is a federal state public health insurance plan that was created for low-income people. The coverage of abortions under Medicaid would decrease the monetary burden of women of color who are financially disadvantaged. As the statistics say on the slide, if women of color do have insurance, more than half of them are on Medicaid as of 2020, proving that Medicaid provides a great deal of their assistance to racial women. The obstacle in allowing Medicaid to cover abortions is that the Hyde Amendment does not allow federal Medicaid money to be used on abortions unless situations of rape, incest, or emergency were to take place. Understanding how the amendment targets the restriction of women of color from getting abortions, Biden has chosen to exclude the Hyde Amendment from his 2022, 2023, and now his 2024 fiscal budget plan. Were these presidential positions effective or ineffective? I believe that Biden and his administration's proclamations for supplying insurance-covered abortions through Medicaid, which would benefit countless women of color, and protecting a woman's right to choose, are effective from an executive standpoint. Firstly, it gives confidence to pro-abortion women by promising not to sign countrywide abortion bills. Also, sharing his alignment with protecting abortion rights, knowing he will receive immense backlash, shows that he's devoted on improving reproductive rights for women. Excluding the Hyde Amendment in the fiscal plan can influence Congress members not to utilize the amendment, since the president can be seen as a role model. It also will increase the chance of a potential abolishment of the amendment altogether in the future. A potential future where the Hyde Amendment is no longer a blockage for healthcare means a future where mortality rates of women of color finally begin to increase. As the state-decided abortion laws started with the overturn of Roe v. Wade in the judicial branch, there's not much Biden, the executive branch, can do to go against the decision of the courts since it is legally binding. Instead, Biden's next steps should be to press, recommend, and persuade the legislative branch on the implications abortions restrictions have on women, particularly women of color. And here is a slide of my references. Thank you so much for listening.